we get defensive. We protect ourselves against the perception of having flaws. Thank you very much. I would like to start by telling you some stories. Picture this. You are planning a meeting with other activists, and you can really feel the energy in the room. Like, everyone's very motivated. But as the meeting progresses, subtle dynamics start to emerge. Certain voices start to dominate the conversation. Decisions are made quickly without much room for different opinions. And there is an unspoken pressure to conform to a particular way of doing things, often driven by those who are seen as more experienced or more vocal. Now, let's say that the conversation shifts to a division of responsibilities for an upcoming event. Some members start to feel overwhelmed, noticing that the same people always end up with the bulk of the work. And there is some frustration, but instead of openly discussing the imbalance, the group pushes forward. And they prioritize the urgency of the event over addressing the underlying tension. Or imagine that the group is planning a big campaign, and there is a clash over tactics. Some believe that civil disobedience is the only way to make an impact, and others favor public outreach. And instead of having a constructive dialogue about these differences, the group begin to shame each other, and they say that they're not committed enough to the cause. And finally, picture a conflict between a well-known leader and a few group members who voice concerns about this leader's behavior. And the leader, instead of addressing the concerns, takes control over the situation. And they introduce a superficial mediation process that lacks real substance and start to reduce the resources available to those who want to navigate the conflict. They start to publicly shame them and saying that they are divisive to the movement, they are harmful to the movement, and the power dynamics really remain unchanged, but the trust within the group starts to break. And I would like to pause here and ask if any of this sounds familiar to you. And if so, let me tell you that this is not unique to any one group or any specific movement. I've supported many groups in Latin America, the US, and Europe, and we've built capacity to navigate conflict, but these are some of the stories that they've shared with me. And this is actually a pattern that plays out across our activism spaces. Yeah. This is the manifestation of the dominant culture, a culture shaped by white supremacy and other oppressive systems that influence how we interact, how we make decisions, and how we think about our activism. This dominant culture is very sneaky because it often goes unrecognized. Many may consider what I just shared on the stories as minor, as irrelevant, normal, or not much of a problem. But there it lies its power. This dominant culture shapes our behaviors, our norms, and our beliefs in ways that it can undermine our intentions, even if we're aiming for justice and equity. This culture values speed over deliberation. It values hierarchy over collaboration, and individualism over community. And when these values start to spread into our activism, they can replicate the very forms of oppression we are fighting against. So I want to share 3 characteristics of this dominant culture and how these show up in our activism spaces. And I want to start with power and control. And it can show up as paternalism, when there are authority figures that know best and make decisions on behalf of others. It can also show as power hoarding when those in power came to be the authority figures that I just mentioned. And when conflict arises, those in power are the ones that get to protect their emotional comfort. This dominant culture also loves external validation. And it defines progress as being bigger, achieving more, and it starts to glorify perpetual expansion. If things can't be measured, they have no value. And there is never enough time, especially for the internal work of our groups. And lastly, there is binary thinking. And we get defensive. We protect ourselves against the perception of having flaws. We embrace an either-or mentality that oversimplifies everything into opposing pairs. And we define one right way to deal with conflict, and that is to avoid it. Open disagreements are considered impolite, are considered divisive, and superficial niceness is rewarded. And these characteristics are not just abstract concepts. They have real impacts on our activism spaces. They create environments where power is concentrated in the hands of a few, where voices are silenced or marginalized, and where the collective well-being of the group is sacrificed in the name of efficiency or progress. But it is also important to recognize that these dynamics don't just arise out of nowhere. They are the result of living in a world shaped by centuries of structural harm. These are the legacies of colonization, of slavery, of patriarchy, and other forms of oppression that have shaped the culture we live in. And because we've all grown up in this world, these patterns have shaped us too. And we must assume that they are present in our relationships, that they are present in our activism spaces, even if we don't immediately recognize them. So, how do we begin to uncover these harmful patterns? Well, the first step will be to acknowledge that the problem is not just with individual behaviors, but with the systems and structures that govern how we work together. If we are working towards collective liberation, we need to challenge the very foundations of how we organize. We need to shift our focus from merely resolving conflict to transforming the conditions that allowed conflict to arise in the first place. This means moving away from punitive measures to a culture of self-accountability. So let's unpack what this looks like in practice. When a conflict arises in an activism group, the immediate reaction often is to call for accountability. But what does accountability really mean? In many cases, it is interpreted as finding someone to blame and ensuring that they face punishment, not transformation. And true accountability, as Shannon Perez Darby describes, is a human skill. It's not something that happens to bad people. Accountability is the capacity to reflect on our own actions, to understand their impact, and to take steps to repair harm and to prevent it from happening again. And like any skill, accountability requires practice on both individual and collective level. So to build communities based on care and accountability, we need to start with some fundamental assumptions. The first one is that everyone deserves support. And the second one is that there is a gap between our desire to support everyone and our ability to do so. So we must be honest about our limitations and work to build our capacity for self-accountability. We all have the capacity to harm each other, and that is the third assumption. But that doesn't mean that we are inherently bad. It means that we live in a world that has taught us harmful ways of behaving, and we need to unlearn them. As long as we label people as good or bad, there will be a tendency to hide our mistakes, to avoid being seen as bad, and that will prevent true accountability. So how do we start shifting our activism spaces from ones dominated by harmful cultural patterns to ones rooted in self-accountability? Well, I have some suggestions. And the first one is to question our current strategies for accountability. Are we supporting people to heal? Are we supporting people to transform? Are we building capacity to prevent harm from happening again? Or are we simply seeking to punish those who have caused harm? Then I will suggest to define safety. Even if it seems utopian, we need to think, how will it feel to feel safe enough to ask for support? What do I need to feel safe when accepting that I have harmed others? And what do I need to feel safe enough to do the vulnerable work of healing and transforming? Then, don't be a savior. Don't try to solve every problem for everyone. Focus on what your community needs and what you need, and work on that. And the last suggestion, and probably the most important one that I want to share, is to practice. Transformation doesn't happen overnight. It is a continuous process that requires practice. And many of us have limited opportunities to practice accountability in the context of dismantling systems of oppression. We can all have compassion for ourselves and for each other in not knowing how to transform conflict. We are all practicing in real time, and we will make mistakes. And we can and should learn from those mistakes as we go. So let's recognize that the act of coming together to dismantle systems of oppression will require us to disrupt comfortability. It will require from us to question respectability politics and to acknowledge the negative impacts of this culture of dominance and supremacy in our groups. Our movement's strength lies not just in our ability to advocate for animals, but in our commitment to creating spaces where everyone can thrive, humans and non-humans alike. This means actively challenging the culture of dominance and supremacy and replacing it with practices that reflect the values of justice, equity, and collective liberation. So I encourage you to take these ideas back to your communities and your organizations, and don't just host workshops. Practice what you preach. Build the skills. Reimagine the structures, and dedicate the time and other resources necessary for true transformation. And I want to leave you with this quote from Audre Lorde, which basically inspired the work that I do with transforming culture, because I realized that we are very good at demanding change. We are very good at doing work to the outside, to the public. But we often forget the work that we need to do inside. And Audre Lorde said that the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations which we seek to escape, but the peace of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. and knows only the oppressor's tactics and the oppressor's relationships. And before I end, I want to plug the workshop that I have in tomorrow at 10:50, where we are going to practice some of the things that I'm talking here right now. So, yeah, thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you, Josue. So we do have some time for interactions, questions, comments. Does anyone have any of that? Okay. So I'll come to you first, and then I'll come to the back.
Hi, thank you. Very amazing and important talk. The concept of the dominant culture is still a bit abstract to me. Could you elaborate a bit more on what it is and how it looks like in practice?
Thank you. Good question. I often struggle to define dominant culture because it can be many things. But I will say that it is those apparently small things that we take for granted, that we still consider as normal. When we think of white supremacy, we might think of very explicit ways of harm or of hate. But there are subtle things that are still in the way we organize, in the way that we have our meetings, and the way that we distribute the work in our teams. And I will define that as dominant culture, is that water that we're swimming in that we may not see, but we're in it all the time. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Hello, thank you so much for that. I just love hearing about this stuff. I was just interested if you had any maybe stories or examples from your work where you've gone in and talked to people and how that's looked. I'd just love to learn a bit more about that.
Sure. Well, I don't really go to talk to people about this. I get contacted by groups that want to change the way that navigate conflict. And I just basically help them build capacity. So I'm not an expert on how to navigate the conflict, but as the quote from Audre Lorde mentioned, I think that is a part of the work that we are missing. So I facilitate the spaces for us to practice. And that practice can be something quite simple as just giving and receiving feedback and getting used to that interaction, because it can be very uncomfortable at times. And it can be setting group guidelines or expectations, like who is part of a group, why are you part of a group, who is not going to be part of a group, how are we expected to behave in the group, and not just talk about it, because we can, if we have a website for the organization, we can put whatever we want as our values there, but that doesn't mean that we're actually practicing it. But if we take the time to find those shared values in our group, and we describe how those values look in practice and create spaces for us to get familiar with that behavior, we can navigate conflict in a better way. So that's pretty much what I do. And among other things, the point is to create spaces for people to practice, to build that capacity. And that capacity is going to be different for each group that I work with.
Okay, thank you. We do have another question from the audience, and also shout out to our online community. If you do have a question, feel free to post it in the chat or in the Q&A section, sorry. And then we come to the next question.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us of this very important topic. I think it's a blind spot in the movement. My question is, if you find yourself in a dominant culture, in an organization where dominant culture is, well, dominant, when is the point to decide, okay, I have to get out? Because I have witnessed it very often, the cause is extremely important for those people. The organization is also extremely important for those people, but maybe there is a point where they just cannot take it any longer personally, and they don't really want to leave the organization. They want the organization to be better, but maybe there's a point where you cannot save it and just have to leave it to save yourself. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think it's a very difficult one to answer because it can be different for everyone. What I would do is to take the time to be clear about my values and be honest whether this organization is really aligning with my values or not. And that's for me to decide whether I want to stay there. I think where you are in a situation of conflict, you have three choices. You can accept how the situation is, you can try to change it, and you can step back. So the decision is yours. What I will do, like I said, is to define my values, compare it to the organization, and make that decision. And it's very tricky because I think even our perception of big organizations are the ones that are doing most of the work or most valuable work is part also of the dominant culture. I think the small groups are the ones that are doing most of the impact that maybe we don't know about, but we don't need to know about them. We know about the big organizations because they have the budget and they have the publicity and they have like influencers and all that stuff. But the real work is small work, and I will encourage you to embrace hyper-local mentality. And if any of you are not feeling aligned with the organization, chances are that more people are not. And maybe you can create your own small group, and I will encourage you to not skip the part of creating those shared values and doing the work before you go in the streets and do the other work that we still need to do.
All right, thank you. Is there another question or comment in the audience?
If not, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have some resources that I want to share.
Perfect, thank you.
You can take a picture of this. These are amazing books that have shaped the way transforming culture does its work. And yeah, read them. And I think it will be important to mention that my work is based on the transformative justice movement. And it is called transformative justice because it got popularized in the US recently. But it's not only based on that. Indigenous communities have been creating and maintaining ways of organizing that don't align with what is established by the state. And that work is also inspired by that. So yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to the people in the US doing transformative justice work, abolition work, and the indigenous communities that maybe don't put a name to this because this is the normal for them.
Thank you. So, okay, I see another question here, or comment.
Hello. I have a comment, not a question. Oh, can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah.
It's a comment, not a question. But first, I just want to say thank you for all that you are, all that you do. I feel like in this conference, there have been so many eye-opening distribution of information and strategies. And one thing that I think has been missing for me as a person of color that's been working on decolonizing my mind and my lifestyle is this idea of oppression and even this internalized oppressor, right? And so I really appreciated that you included that, or you closed with that, you know, we're all oppressors to some extent, and it's something worth examining because all oppression is connected and therefore our liberation. So thank you so much for filling in that gap of intersectional collective liberation. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
All right, if there's another question in the meantime or comment. Oh, I see one here. Okay. We do still have a few minutes time, so I want to make sure that everyone can get the interaction.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to, because we've seen a lot of people talk, and your talk, it's very interesting, lots of interesting things, but I just want to know a little bit more about you. You know, you've come up here, you've told us some interesting stuff, but I'm left with this sensation of who are you, and you know, because there's so few people who've been on this stage that look like you, or me.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. So, hi, I'm Josue. I'm Guatemalan. I live there, and I've been active in this movement for about 8 years now. And I play many roles. I've been a volunteer, I've been a full-time organizer with groups in Guatemala, in Colombia, Costa Rica, the US, and the UK. And everywhere I've been, I see the same struggle of navigating conflict within the groups. I've seen many groups dismantle because of not knowing how to navigate the conflict. I've seen a lot of people pushed out of groups because the dominant part of the group uses their authority to kick them out, and I've been kicked out as well. But I also been the organizer, the person in a leadership position that didn't know how to navigate conflict. And I've been doing this work for the last 3 years, specifically on how to navigate conflict. And like I mentioned, I am in no way an expert on how to navigate conflict. What I see is that we lack the spaces for us to practice the values that we say that we want to see in the world, because we are used to being in a world that doesn't practice those values. Like, we have very few examples of how that looks like. So what I'm trying to do with Transforming Culture is to create spaces where people can imagine how that looks and create it, and it's gonna look different for everyone. And yeah, that's me, that's what I'm doing, that's why I'm out here. Thank you.
Is there another question in the audience or a comment? Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to make a quick comment and say I was just sat in the previous talk and I was getting more and more frustrated. I don't know if anyone else in here felt the same, but it kind of made me feel like, how are so many people agreeing with what was being said? So now we come to your talk, and I'm really pleased that we stayed, because it was like a breath of fresh air, and it was so positive and so inclusive, and you're actually doing the good work that's actually going to make a difference in our movement. So yeah, just thank you for that. It's like made me more uplifted.
Thank you so much for that comment.
Thank you. All right. So if there is not another question or comment, once again, thank you so much for your very interesting presentation and for being here.
Thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow for the workshop.